Chapter 3 Blood in the Storm. The goal of war was not to kill outright, but to stifle those who would do harm to the innocent. Therefore, the Askari's mission is one of protection, to ensure that innocents are protected from those who seek to do them harm. Yamansa, way of the Askari. The night sky illuminated in a blinding flash as lightning streaked across the heavens, illuminating the dense clouds that hovered menacingly above. Rain fell like a heavy curtain, drowning out the sounds of the jungle. Amadi jumped, shivering in knee-deep sludge. His father, Akachi, stepped unfazed through the sludge, which covered his brown leather boots. Another streak of white light was followed by a crashing boom. Amadi stumbled over his own feet, desperately trying to keep up with his father's hurried steps. A wave of panic surged through his body as he realized how far he had fallen behind. They trudged through the mud and thorns, past vines and branches, but had yet to find the village. The darkness of night, coupled with the rain shrouding their every move, made every tall tree and bush become a looming figure that could have killed them at any moment. The sound of the howling wind and rustling plants was swallowed up by the snarling of famished predators, searching for their next meal. Their lives were in danger with every step they took. "Hurry up, Amadi," Akachi barked as he dragged Amadi by the arm. "The cave is around here somewhere. I've had enough of this cursed rain." Akachi uttered the words in a torrent of anger, his grip on Amadi's arm tightening as he pushed forward. Amadi stumbled, his foot caught on a rock, and plunged into the mud below. "Get up!" Akachi commanded. Propelled by fear, Amadi jumped to his feet. Though the storm rendered his vision nearly useless, he did not disobey his father's directions. His gaze drifted to his hands, which were faintly marked with bruises. He flexed his fingers, wincing at the pain. He felt the warmth seeping through his skin as a soft red light of his boko radiated from his palms. His wounds closed, and the pain subsided. The sudden shock of a hard slap crashed him back into the ground. Searing heat spread from the back of his neck all the way to the tips of his toes. His vision blurred and fogged over as tears welled up in his eyes and his bottom lip quivered. A scream threatened to burst from his throat, but he clamped his lips together, forcing it back down. If he were to cry, his punishment would be far worse. A fist slamming into his solar plexus, a boot connecting with his ribs, or perhaps something even more powerful. "What part of don't use boko when traveling at night? Don't you understand?" Akachi snarled. "But father, my hands," Amadi pleaded, his voice weakening with fright as the tears threatened to spill from his eyes. "But nothing, boy. You are drawing too much focus on us." Akachi yanked Amadi back up to his feet and shoved him forward, frustration clear on his face. His father's voice echoed in his ears and birthed a fear greater than the storm itself. The waves of rain battered against Amadi's skin, crashing against him like a relentless army. But father's rage and brutality drove his body forward, pushing him beyond the brink of exhaustion, because he understood that pausing even for an instant could have devastating consequences. The rain slowly faded until it was just a mist in the air. Amadi thought to cast a revealing spell to check for the cave, but feared the consequences that he would face if he did. Suddenly shadows darted between the bushes nearby, startling him. He froze in place, unsure of what to do. "Keep moving," Akachi ordered. "There is nothing to fear in these jungles." "You'd better do what your father says, and just keep going," an unfamiliar voice snarled. Amadi nervously glanced around, but couldn't see anything but the massive trunks of trees and unruly bushes. 4 menacing figures emerged from the shadows. Outcast, criminals like Amadi and Akachi, their clothes tarnished and tattered. 2 of them brandished swords, while another had an arrow drawn and pointed at Akachi. The last man was a Blackguard, with fiery orange boko seeping through his fingers. Amadi shivered beside his father as the menacing outcasts closed in on them, their eyes full of ill intent. "Surrender your gold, food, and anything of worth, or I'll run you through myself," the Blackguard demanded. Akachi laughed. "I would sooner perish than let you have my coin," Akachi said with a haughty air. His words were confident and unwavering. Sinister smiles crept across their faces as they encroached on Amadi and Akachi. "We can certainly arrange your death," the swordsman said, greed gleaming in his eyes. Amadi clung to his father's back, trembling uncontrollably. These men were terrifying. The scars on their faces and the tatters in their clothing revealed a lifetime of suffering. Their expressions were cold and unyielding, like a pack of hyenas that had just spotted two helpless gazelles. But Akachi was no gazelle. He was a lion. A faint crimson surged from Akachi's fingertips as he cupped them into the murky ground. "What do we have here, boys?" one of them sneered. "Looks like we've found ourselves a Blackguard." The outcast Blackguard nodded smugly. "No matter. We'll fillet his corpse just like the others." Akachi reached his hand into the dark mud, his brows furrowed in concentration. The sludge of dirt, branches, and undergrowth took shape in his hands. His fingers closed on a thick, rough-hewn piece of wood about 6 inches. As he pulled it up from the mud, a lash measuring nearly 6 feet sprouted from the wooden handle. Across its length, embedded pieces of metal, shards of glass, and rust-covered nails protruded from it. An arrow sailed through the air towards Akachi. He deflected it with his bokko as a burst of red energy sent the arrow careening away. The two swordsmen charged, their blades slicing and stabbing through the air. Akachi shoved Amadi to the ground as he ducked away from the amateurish attack of the outcast. With one quick snap of the whip, it became entangled tightly around the blade of one swordsman. Akachi yanked the sword from the outcast grip, and it lodged with a sickening thud deep in the other swordsman's chest. The man cried out in pain before he slumped to the ground, dead. Akachi fired a red blast from his palm as fast as lightning into the other swordsman that slammed him backwards into a nearby tree. Amadi scurried away, cowering behind a measly shrubbery as an arrow zipped past him. The outcast Blackguard unleashed a blast of orange bokko. Akachi effortlessly deflected it with a surge of his own as the two energies collided in an explosion. With a wave of his hand, Akachi summoned an army of swords blazing with red bokko. 20 blades of varying length and shape floated above like liquid fire. With a clenched fist, he commanded the blades down like a hailstorm. They sliced into the outcast's body from all directions. The man screamed as each one sliced into his flesh. Blood erupted from the wounds. He dropped to the ground dead, a lifeless heap of decaying flesh. "You'll suffer for that!" the archer outcast shouted as the arrow he released flew past Akachi's face in a blur. Only the swordless swordsman and the archer remain. The archer let loose another arrow, aiming it at Amadi this time. Akachi spun around and stretched out his hand, catching the arrow in midair with red bokko. He then hurled it back at the archer. The archer attempted to duck out of its way, but the arrow stabbed into his shoulder. Akachi let out a loud shriek that made Amadi jump in surprise at the unexpected outburst from his father. The swordsman had pulled a hidden dagger and mercilessly plunged it into Akachi's ribcage. Undaunted, Akachi placed 2 fingers together and unleashed a raging scarlet beam of bokko, searing straight through the outcast's skull. Blood and brain matter sprayed in all directions as chunks of bone and flesh scattered, leaving a nauseating trail of carnage on the ground. Akachi cupped his hand around his wound, allowing his bokko to seep in and mend it. He focused his attention on the archer outcast. The man gasped when he realized Akachi was coming in his direction. He pulled an arrow from over his shoulder and knocked it into his bowstring, but with a swift snap of the whip, the bow was knocked from his hands. He then reached to draw a small blade, but another snap of the whip knocked it from his grip. Akachi unleashed a blast of red bokko that slammed the outcast against a tree. The tree seemed to come alive as red bokko coursed through it. Branches and vines enveloped the outcast, imprisoning him. Despite his desperate thrashing, the more he strained with all his might to break free, the tighter the binds became, further entrapping him in relentless woody coils. Akachi released his whip, letting it fall and dissolve into the murky soil beneath his feet. He stepped right up to the outcast and stared him down. He spat out the words like venom. "Your friends are dead, outcast." The maliciousness in his voice radiated like a cold Seifun night. The outcast's face contorted in rage as he spat in Akachi's face. "You expect me to beg for my life, Blackguard?" He threshed about, trying to break free from the vines that wound round his neck, waist, wrists, and ankles. He was completely immobilized. Akachi smirked as he wiped away the spittle. "No use begging," he said. "It isn't going to do you any good. Son, come." Amadi cowered behind some shrubs, terror in his heart. He wanted to fight, to prove himself a man, but he didn't want to die. His father's eyes pierced him with a gaze that seemed to freeze his soul. Amadi slowly stood up, his body tense with fear. "Now, boy!" In an instant, Amadi was up and hurried to join his father. He stared in shock as his father handed him the dagger. It was the dagger that had tasted his father's flesh, its blade still tainted with his father's blood. He felt the weight of it as Akachi placed it in his hands and moved him in front of the captive outcast. Amadi was horrified. His heart raced with terror and conflicted emotions. Part of him wanted to avenge his father, but another part of him couldn't bring himself to take a life. He trembled as he held the weapon, unsure if he had the strength to do what needed to be done. "Kill him," Akachi demanded. Amadi locked gazes with the outcast. The man seemed ready to die with an expression devoid of any emotions. "I can't," Amadi whispered, finding it difficult to utter the words. "Outcast like him would take your life without a moment's hesitation. They would murder you with the same ease as you would slaughter a fawn. These outcasts would have dismembered you, these monsters. They would have gutted and skinned you alive, and then left your body to rot with the maggots had I not been here. You dare show him mercy!" Akachi yelled. "Father, I... Amadi's words stuttered in the air, hanging helplessly in the face of his father's seething fury. Nothing he could say would alleviate his father's wrath. Amadi felt an unnatural heat as he looked down to see a red energy swirling around his hands like a flame consuming them. The dagger felt heavy, like another controlled it. He glanced towards his father, whose eyes were filled with hatred. Amadi tried to fight it, tried to push back, tried to take control of his limbs, but it was no use. His arms moved of their own volition as they raised the blade towards the outcast's abdomen. The blade dug deep into the outcast's chest. "Never show your enemies mercy, boy." Akachi's voice was as cold as the steel. The outcast's face contorted in agony as Akachi's boko gripped Amadi's hands and forced him to twist the blade and slice upward, cutting through skin and muscle until a thick gush of blood splattered onto Amadi. Blood and gore spilled onto his face and clothes. He stood there in a frozen state of shock, the metallic scent filling the air and the warmth of life slowly seeping away from him. Unable to comprehend the horrifying scene before him, Amadi remained silent. "Let's go," Akachi said. "We have a cave to find." Amadi trailed after him as the rain poured down again.